The summer of 2010 brought fear to the Midwest, particularly in the heart of Flint, Michigan. What began as sporadic reports of brutal stabbings soon turned into a terrifying pattern, a spree of seemingly random attacks targeting vulnerable individuals walking alone at night. These crimes would eventually span multiple states, baffling law enforcement and leaving communities gripped by fear. It wasn't until months later that the man behind these heinous acts, Elias Abuelazam, was unmasked as the shadowy figure behind the violence. This is the story of Elias Abuelazam, the man whose unchecked rage turned him into a cross-state serial killer, leaving behind a legacy of terror and unanswered questions. Born in Ramla, Israel, in 1976, Elias Abuelazam grew up in a culturally rich yet tumultuous environment. Little about his childhood hinted at the man he would become. He was part of a family deeply embedded in the fabric of their community, and neighbors described him as polite but introverted. At 19, Abuelazam moved to the United States, seeking a better life. His destination was Virginia, where he lived with relatives and began working menial jobs. He appeared to settle into American life, finding employment in retail and building a modest existence for himself. However, beneath his quiet demeanor lurked a storm of unresolved anger and mental instability. Those who encountered Abuelazam often noted his volatile temper. While he could be charming, his friendliness was frequently punctuated by moments of hostility. Friends described him as a man who seemed perpetually on edge, harboring frustrations he couldn't articulate. This dichotomy, the calm exterior concealing inner turmoil, would later become a chilling hallmark of his crimes. The horror began in Flint, Michigan, a city struggling with economic decline. On May 24, 2010, 31-year-old David Motley was walking home when he encountered a man who asked him for directions. Before Motley could respond, the stranger produced a knife and stabbed him in the chest. Bleeding profusely, Motley collapsed, barely surviving the attack. Motley's account was chilling. The assailant was a tall, heavy-set man with a dark complexion, and his approach had been sudden and unpredictable. In the coming weeks, more attacks followed, each eerily similar in method. The victims, all ambushed late at night, were predominantly African-American men. The stabbings were swift, brutal, and fatal in many cases. By August, 14 people had been attacked, with 5 losing their lives. As the body count rose, fear spread through Flint like wildfire. Residents avoided walking alone, especially at night, and the streets became eerily empty after sundown. Rumors swirled of a racial motive, given the demographic profile of the victims. However, investigators remained cautious, unwilling to speculate until they had concrete evidence. By late July 2010, the attacks expanded beyond Flint. In Toledo, Ohio, and Leesburg, Virginia, similar stabbings were reported, all fitting the same modus operandi. The assailant's description, a man approaching his victims under the pretense of needing assistance before launching a sudden attack, was consistent across all cases. The realization that the killer was traveling across state lines complicated the investigation. Law enforcement agencies in Michigan, Ohio, and Virginia began collaborating, sharing evidence and pooling resources. The FBI was called in to assist, as the case now involved multiple jurisdictions. Despite their efforts, the randomness of the attacks made predicting the killer's next move nearly impossible. The only pattern was the selection of victims, individuals who were alone and unsuspecting. This unpredictability made the killer especially dangerous, as no one could determine where he might strike next. As investigators struggled to catch the elusive assailant, forensic psychologists were brought in to develop a profile of the killer. They described him as a deeply troubled individual, likely grappling with feelings of inadequacy and resentment. His choice of victims suggested he saw them as easy targets, possibly channeling his frustrations into acts of violence against those he perceived as weaker. The method of attack, stabbing, was also significant. Psychologists noted that stabbing is an intensely personal act, often indicative of deep-seated rage. The randomness of the assaults suggested a lack of a clear motive, adding to the complexity of the case. Was this man acting out of racial hatred, or was he simply an opportunistic predator who sought out the vulnerable? The breakthrough came in early August 2010 when a critical piece of evidence surfaced. investigators reviewing surveillance footage from a Flint convenience store noticed a suspicious man purchasing a knife similar to the one used in the attacks. The store's employees identified the man as Elias Abuelazam, a former employee who had left under mysterious circumstances. Further investigation revealed a troubling history. Abuelazam had been involved in several violent incidents, including an assault in Virginia earlier that year. Most damningly, DNA evidence from one of the crime scenes matched his profile. With this information, authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. On August 11, 2010, Elias Abuelazam was apprehended at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. He was attempting to board a flight to Tel Aviv, Israel, in what appeared to be an effort to flee the country. His arrest marked the end of a months-long reign of terror, but it also raised new questions. Why had he chosen to kill? Was he planning to continue his spree abroad? Abuelazam's demeanor during his arrest was unsettling. He appeared calm, even indifferent, as though he didn't fully grasp the gravity of his actions. This detachment would become a focal point during his trial, as his defense team argued that he suffered from severe mental illness. Elias Abuelazam's trial began in May 2012. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, including eyewitness testimony, DNA matches, and surveillance footage. They painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer who preyed on the vulnerable without remorse. The defense, however, argued that Abuelazam was not mentally competent to stand trial. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified that he suffered from paranoia and delusions, which they claimed impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. The jury, however, was unconvinced. After deliberating for several hours, they found Abuelazam guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Arnold Miner, one of his Flint victims. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite his conviction, many questions remain about Elias Abuelazam and his motivations. Why did he target the specific individuals he did? Was there a racial or personal motive behind his crimes, or were they purely opportunistic? How many more might he have killed had he not been apprehended? Abuelazam himself has offered little insight. In interviews conducted after his conviction, he maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. His statements, however, have been inconsistent and largely dismissed by investigators. The terror unleashed by Elias Abuelazam left deep scars on the communities he targeted. Survivors of his attacks continue to grapple with physical and emotional trauma, while the families of his victims struggle to make sense of their loss. For Flint, a city already facing significant challenges, his crimes were a painful reminder of the fragility of safety. Law enforcement agencies have since implemented measures to improve interagency communication, hoping to prevent similar cases in the future. Community leaders have also worked to rebuild trust, offering support to those affected by the crimes. Elias Abuelazam's story is a chilling testament to the darkness that can exist within the human soul. His crimes disrupted lives, shattered families, and left an indelible mark on the communities he targeted. Yet, his capture and conviction also serve as a reminder of the resilience of those who seek justice. In the years since his arrest, his case has been studied by criminologists and psychologists, offering insights into the mind of a modern-day spree killer. His name will forever be associated with fear and violence, but it also stands as a testament to the determination of those who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. As law enforcement and the public sought to make sense of Elias Abuelazam's crimes, the question of motivation loomed large. What could drive a seemingly ordinary man to commit such acts of brutality? Investigators and psychologists pored over his history, piecing together fragments of his life that hinted at underlying mental instability and a simmering rage that may have fueled his actions. Abuelazam had a history of erratic behavior and violent outbursts, often directed at those closest to him. In his youth, friends and acquaintances described him as someone who struggled with rejection and often felt alienated. Despite his attempts to blend into American society, his immigrant experience may have added to a sense of disconnection. This psychological isolation likely deepened over time, leading to a dangerous cocktail of anger and frustration. In the years leading up to his killing spree, Abuelazam faced a string of personal setbacks, including failed relationships and frequent job losses. These frustrations seemed to manifest in increasingly aggressive tendencies. Reports of minor scuffles and arguments were precursors to what would become a devastating explosion of violence. Some experts speculated that Abuelazam's crimes might have been an attempt to assert control in a life he felt was spiraling out of order. One of the most debated aspects of Abuelazam's crimes was the racial profile of his victims. The majority of his targets were African American men, leading many to suspect a racially motivated pattern. Investigators carefully examined this angle, considering whether Abuelazam harbored explicit racial animus or if his choice of victims was purely opportunistic. While no direct evidence surfaced to confirm racial hatred, the consistency in victim demographics was impossible to ignore. Some criminologists suggested that Abuelazam's crimes could reflect unconscious biases or a predatory instinct that identified African American men as particularly vulnerable. Others argued that the racial component was incidental, a coincidence driven by the neighborhoods he frequented and the individuals he encountered. The debate remains unresolved, but the racial implications of the case have left a lasting mark. For many, Abuelazam's crimes serve as a stark reminder of the broader societal tensions that exist and the ways in which race can play an unspoken role in even the most random acts of violence. While the public followed the terror through news reports and updates, the behind-the-scenes efforts of law enforcement were nothing short of Herculean. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the case required unprecedented coordination between local police departments, state agencies, and the FBI. Detectives worked around the clock, analyzing crime scenes, interviewing survivors, and cross-referencing evidence from Michigan, Ohio, and Virginia. The randomness of the attacks posed significant challenges, as there were no clear patterns in location or timing. Each attack seemed to come out of nowhere, leaving investigators perpetually one step behind. The break in the case came not from advanced forensic technology but from old-fashioned detective work. When police connected Elias Abuelazam to a knife purchase at a Flint convenience store, they began retracing his movements, uncovering a trail of inconsistencies and suspicious behavior. Once his name was flagged, investigators realized he had been on their radar for minor offenses in multiple states, but the pieces had never been connected until now. Since his conviction, Elias Abuelazam has spent his days in a Michigan prison, isolated from the world he once terrorized. In interviews conducted after his incarceration, he has alternated between claiming innocence and offering cryptic statements about his actions. His lack of remorse has only deepened the pain for his victims' families, who continue to seek answers that may never come. Abuelazam's life in prison is a stark contrast to the chaos he once wrought. Confined to a cell for most of the day, he has little contact with other inmates and is closely monitored by prison staff. His appeal efforts have been met with rejection, solidifying his fate as a lifer in the Michigan penal system. For criminologists and psychologists, Abuelazam remains a fascinating case study. His crimes defy easy categorization, blending elements of a spree killer and a serial killer. Unlike many high-profile killers, he left no manifesto, no clear ideology to explain his actions. This lack of clarity has made him an enduring enigma in the annals of American crime. The case of Elias Abuelazam forced law enforcement agencies to confront significant challenges in their investigative processes. The multi-state nature of his crimes highlighted the difficulties of coordinating across jurisdictions, particularly when evidence and resources are spread thin. In response, agencies have implemented measures to improve interagency communication and data sharing. These changes aim to ensure that future cases involving mobile criminals can be addressed more effectively. Additionally, the use of public tip lines and community outreach programs has been enhanced, reflecting the critical role that citizen input played in Abuelazam's capture. For criminologists, the case has provided valuable insights into the psychology of spree killers. Unlike serial killers, who often have long cooling-off periods between crimes, spree killers like Abuelazam operate in a state of near-constant escalation. Understanding this behavior is key to identifying and stopping such individuals before they can inflict further harm. Even years after his conviction, Elias Abuelazam continues to provoke questions and speculation. What truly drove him to commit such heinous acts? Was he a man overwhelmed by his own demons, or was he simply an opportunistic predator who reveled in the chaos he created? These questions may never be fully answered, leaving a void that only deepens the mystery surrounding his crimes. For the families of his victims, the focus remains on preserving the memory of their loved ones and finding ways to move forward in the face of unimaginable loss. The case of Elias Abuelazam stands as a grim reminder of the fragility of safety and the devastating impact of unchecked violence. His crimes disrupted lives, fractured communities, and left a trail of pain that will take generations to mend. Yet, his capture and conviction also highlight the resilience of the human spirit and the unwavering commitment of those who seek justice. While his name may fade from headlines, the lessons learned from his actions will endure, shaping the ways we protect our communities and confront the darkest corners of human behavior.